When my wife, Claire, and I first decided to buy a house, we dreamed of finding a place where we could truly feel at home. We wanted something cozy but with enough space for us to grow, not just as people, but maybe even as gardeners. After months of searching, we finally found it. A beautiful little house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It had 3 bedrooms, a small backyard that screamed potential, and neighbors who seemed genuinely friendly. At least they waved every time we drove by during our visits. The day we moved in felt like the start of a new chapter. The movers left. The boxes were stacked neatly against the walls, and we stood in the middle of our empty living room, grinning at each other. "This is it," Claire said, her voice full of excitement. "Our forever home." And honestly, I couldn't have agreed more. Everything about this place felt perfect. The streets were clean, the lawns were manicured, and kids laughed as they rode their bikes up and down the cul-de-sac. Even the air smelled fresh, like possibility. What made this neighborhood stand out, though, was the fact that it had a homeowners association, or HOA, as everyone called it. At first, I didn't think much about it. To me, an HOA sounded like one of those things you hear about, but never really pay attention to. You know, the kind of organization that keeps everything looking nice and makes sure no one paints their house neon green or leaves old cars on blocks in their driveway. Honestly, I thought it would be helpful. Who wouldn't want to live in a place where rules ensured safety, cleanliness, and order? The HOA president, Mr. Peterson, stopped by shortly after we moved in to welcome us. He was a tall man with silver hair and a firm handshake. He handed us a thick packet filled with guidelines and explained how the HOA worked. There were rules about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and even mailbox designs. Nothing too crazy, he assured us. Just basic stuff to keep the neighborhood looking its best. Claire flipped through the pages while nodding politely, and I smiled along, thinking, how hard can this be? For the first few weeks, life was blissfully normal. We started unpacking, arranged furniture, and began dreaming about what we'd do with the backyard. Claire loved the idea of planting flowers along the fence, while I couldn't wait to build raised beds for vegetables. Tomatoes, peppers, maybe even some herbs. It all sounded so peaceful. Our neighbors popped over now and then to introduce themselves, bringing cookies or bottles of wine. Everyone seemed so warm and welcoming. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect community, something was lurking, something I hadn't noticed yet. Little did I know, those neatly typed rules in the HOA packet weren't just suggestions. They were commandments, enforced with surprising strictness. And soon enough, I find myself face to face with the reality of living in a neighborhood governed by an HOA. What started as a dream home was about to become the setting for a battle I never saw coming. It was Claire who convinced me to go to my first HOA meeting. "Come on," she said one evening, sipping her tea at the kitchen table. "It'll be good to meet more people and learn how things work around here." I hesitated. The thought of sitting in a room discussing neighborhood rules didn't exactly excite me, but I agreed because, well, she had a point. Plus, I figured it couldn't hurt to show my face and get a better understanding of this HOA everyone kept talking about. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a small bland room above the community pool. When we walked in, I noticed most of the chairs were already filled with familiar faces, neighbors I'd waved to on the street or seen walking their dogs. Mr. Peterson stood at the front, smiling warmly as he welcomed everyone. He started off by thanking us for coming and then dove straight into the agenda. That's when things took a turn. First up, holiday decorations. Someone had complained that a few houses still had Christmas lights up in February. Yes, you read that right. February. Apparently, there was a strict deadline for taking down decorations, and some residents weren't following it. A woman named Linda raised her hand and suggested sending warning letters to offenders. She spoke with such conviction, like leaving up twinkle lights past New Year's was practically a crime against humanity. Then came the discussion about mailboxes. Mailboxes. I kid you not, They spent nearly 20 minutes debating whether certain colors were acceptable. One guy argued that his dark blue mailbox clashed with the approved palette of beige and gray, and someone else chimed in to agree. Another neighbor suggested creating the committee to inspect all mailboxes for compliance. At this point, I glanced at Claire, who looked equally baffled. Was this really what our HOA meetings were about? But the piece de resistance, the thing that made my jaw drop, was the debate over basketball hoops. Linda, yes, the same Linda, passionately argued that no one should be allowed to have portable hoops in their driveways. Her reasoning: they detracted from curb appeal. Cue the collective eye rolls from half the room. I mean, seriously, kids playing basketball outside was somehow ruining the neighborhood aesthetic. It felt absurd. By the end of the meeting, my head was spinning. These weren't just minor suggestions. These were rigid rules enforced with military precision. And while part of me wanted to laugh it off, another part of me felt uneasy. What happened to personal freedom? To living in a place where you could make your own choices without someone breathing down your neck? As we drove home that night, Claire tried to reassure me. Maybe it's not as bad as it seems, she said. They're just trying to keep things nice. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something about the whole thing rubbed me the wrong way. Sure, guidelines can be helpful, but this felt excessive. Who cared if someone's mailbox was blue instead of beige? Why did every little detail need to be micromanaged? That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something far more complicated than I'd anticipated. This wasn't just a group of neighbors working together. It was a bureaucracy with power, and I had no idea what it meant for us. All I knew was that life in our dream home might not be as simple or as peaceful as we'd hoped. It was a quiet Saturday morning when it happened. Claire and I were sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and planning our day. The sun streamed through the windows, warming the room, and for a moment, everything felt calm and perfect. That's when I noticed something on the floor near the door. A crisp white envelope, slipped underneath like an uninvited guest. My stomach sank as soon as I picked it up. Something about its official appearance made me uneasy. I opened the envelope carefully, almost dreading what was inside. Sure enough, it was a letter from the HOA. At first glance, it looked innocent enough. A formal heading, polite language, and even a little logo in the corner. But as I read further, my blood began to boil. According to the letter, our backyard garden violated Section 4.7 of the community guidelines. Specifically, the raised vegetable beds we built exceeded the maximum allowable height of 12 inches. 12 inches? Who even measures their garden beds? And why did it matter so much? I stared at the paper in disbelief, rereading the sentence over and over, hoping it would somehow change. But no, it was real. We were being told that our tomatoes, peppers, and herbs were too tall. Not only that, but if we didn't fix the issue within 30 days, we'd face fines. Fines for growing food in our own backyard. Claire leaned over to see what I was holding. Her eyes widened as she skimmed the letter. "Are you kidding me?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "This is ridiculous." She tried to stay calm, reminding me that we could lower the beds or apply for a variance, a fancy term for asking permission to break the rules. But her words barely registered. I couldn't believe this was happening. What bothered me most wasn't just the rule itself. It was the tone of the letter. It wasn't friendly or conversational. There was no, "Hey, can you take a look at this?" or "Let's work together to resolve it." No, this was cold and impersonal, written as though we were criminals caught red-handed. The message was clear: comply or else. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside to stare at the garden. It had taken weeks of hard work to build those raised beds. We'd measured, cut wood, hauled soil, and planted seeds, all with the hope of creating something beautiful and functional. Now it felt like someone was telling us we'd done something wrong. I knelt down beside the tomato plants, brushing my fingers against the leaves. They were thriving, reaching toward the sun, completely unaware that they were breaking some invisible rule. As I stood there fuming, I started thinking about the bigger picture. Was this really about garden beds? Or was it about control? Who decided that 12 inches was the magic number? And why did the HOA care so much about how high our vegetables grew? It all seemed so arbitrary, so unnecessary. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the letter, its words etched into my mind. Claire tried to comfort me, saying maybe we could find a way to work things out. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about us. This was about living in a place where every decision, no matter how small, was scrutinized and judged. For the first time since moving in, I began to wonder if this neighborhood was truly the right fit for us. The letter about our garden beds was the spark that lit a fire I didn't know had been building inside me. At first, it felt like we were alone in this fight, just two people against an entire system. But as I started talking to my neighbors, I realized we weren't the only ones frustrated. What began as casual conversations over fences and driveway hellos turned into something much bigger, a movement. It started with Mr. Thompson, who lived 2 doors down. He stopped me one afternoon while I was pulling weeds in the yard. "Hey, Mark," he said, leaning on his rake, "I heard about your run-in with the HOA. Sounds familiar." He went on to tell me how he'd been fined last summer for painting his front door red instead of sticking to the approved beige and gray palette. "They sent me a letter saying it disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood," he said, rolling his eyes. Visual harmony? Really? Then there was Mrs. Patel across the street. She confided that her family had received warnings for letting their dog bark during the day. "We tried everything. Training, calming sprays, even keeping him indoors. But apparently, any noise is too much noise," she said, shaking her head. Her frustration mirrored mine, and suddenly, I didn't feel so isolated. Word spread quickly after that. Neighbors began sharing stories at mailboxes, during evening walks, and over backyard fences. One couple told us they'd been scolded for leaving holiday lights up past January 15th. Another family complained about being forced to replace their mailbox because its design wasn't approved. Each story added fuel to the growing sense of discontent. That's when Claire and I decided to take action. We invited a few neighbors to meet at our house one Saturday morning to discuss what could be done. To our surprise, nearly a dozen people showed up, crowding around our kitchen table with coffee mugs in hand. The energy in the room was electric, part anger, part excitement, and part nervousness. Everyone agreed. Something needed to change. We called ourselves the Backyard Freedom Coalition. A name Claire came up with that made us laugh, but also captured our mission perfectly. Our goal was simple: to push back against unreasonable rules and reclaim a sense of autonomy in our own homes. We brainstormed ideas, from drafting petitions to organizing peaceful protests. Someone suggested using social media to raise awareness, while another neighbor offered to design flyers to distribute throughout the community. As word of the coalition spread, more people joined our cause. Some were hesitant at first, worried about retaliation from the HOA board. But others were eager to speak out, tired of feeling powerless. One woman named Sarah, who had moved here just months before us, became especially vocal. "This isn't about rebelling," she said passionately at one meeting. "It's about reminding them that we're human beings, not entries in some rulebook." Our efforts gained momentum fast. Petitions circulated online and offline, gathering signatures from residents who wanted a voice in how the neighborhood was run. We posted updates on social media, sharing photos of our gardens, clotheslines, and colorful mailboxes alongside messages calling for common sense reforms. The response was overwhelming. People were ready for change. Still, not everyone supported us. A small group of neighbors remained fiercely loyal to the HOA, arguing that strict rules kept property values high and maintained the neighborhood's appeal. They accused us of stirring up trouble and warned that loosening restrictions would lead to chaos. "If you don't like the rules, maybe you should move somewhere else," one man snapped at a meeting. Their criticism stung, but it only strengthened our resolve. We knew we weren't asking for anything outrageous, just the freedom to live comfortably in our own homes without constant interference. And as more neighbors rallied behind us, I began to see glimmers of hope. For the first time since moving here, I felt like I was part of a real community, not just a name on a roster or a target for compliance letters. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, we were ready. Armed with petitions, testimonials, and a united front, we prepared to face the board and demand a seat at the table. Change wouldn't come easily, but we were determined to make our voices heard. After all, this wasn't just about garden beds or clotheslines anymore. It was about taking back control of the place we called home. The tipping point came one evening when the HOA sent out a notice that felt like the final straw. They were planning to ban outdoor clotheslines entirely. Yes, you read that correctly. Clotheslines. According to the HOA, hanging laundry outside was unsightly and inconsistent with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. I couldn't believe it. Clotheslines. Really? This wasn't just overreach anymore. It felt like outright absurdity. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the notice, my hands gripping the edges of the paper. Claire walked in, saw my expression, and immediately knew something was wrong. "What now?" she asked, her voice heavy with resignation. When I showed her the notice, she let out a long sigh. "They can't be serious," she muttered. But they were. Dead serious. That's when I decided enough was enough. If the HOA thought they could control every little detail of our lives, they had another thing coming. I called a meeting with some of the neighbors who had joined our growing coalition, the Backyard Freedom Coalition. We gathered in my garage, armed with coffee, notebooks, and a shared sense of frustration. The mood was tense but determined. Everyone agreed. This clothesline ban was the hill we were willing to die on. At the next HOA meeting, I stood up for the first time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Public speaking isn't exactly my strong suit, but I knew I had to say something. Clearing my throat, I began. "Hi, everyone. My name's Mark, and I've been part of this community for almost a year now. When my wife and I moved here, we thought we were joining a neighborhood that valued safety, order, and community spirit. But lately, I've started to feel like we're living under a microscope." The room went silent. All eyes were on me, and for a second, I wondered if I'd made a huge mistake. But then I kept going. These rules, about mailbox colors, basketball hoops, garden beds, and now clotheslines, they don't make sense. They don't improve our quality of life. They just make us feel like we're constantly being watched and judged. Is that really what we want for our neighborhood? One by one, other members of the coalition spoke up. A young mom talked about how much her kids loved playing basketball in the driveway. An elderly man shared how drying his clothes outside helped him save money on energy bills. Even Linda, the same Linda who hated basketball hoops, admitted she sometimes felt suffocated by the endless regulations. The room buzzed with tension as people nodded, whispered, and exchanged glances. Mr. Peterson tried to maintain control, reminding everyone that the HOA existed to protect property values. But his arguments fell flat. You could see it in the faces of the other board members. They were starting to realize they'd pushed too far. By the end of the meeting, they hadn't given us everything we wanted, but they did agree to revisit certain policies, including the infamous clothesline ban. It wasn't a total victory, but it was progress. Driving home that night, I felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph. For the first time, I realized the power of standing together. Maybe we couldn't change everything overnight, but we planted a seed. And like the tomatoes in my backyard, I knew it would grow, with patience, persistence, and a little bit of sunlight. In the weeks that followed the big showdown at the HOA meeting, things didn't change overnight. But there was a shift, a subtle but undeniable sense that the neighborhood was waking up to something bigger than just rules and regulations. The Backyard Freedom Coalition kept meeting regularly, strategizing ways to push for more changes without burning bridges. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't fast, but progress came in small, steady steps. First, the HOA announced they'd relax the rule about garden bed heights. Instead of enforcing the strict 12-inch limit, they agreed to raise it to 18 inches. 18 inches might not sound like much, but for me, it felt like a victory. Claire and I celebrated by planting an extra row of peppers in the newly expanded beds. Sure, it wasn't complete freedom, but it was enough to make us feel like we were reclaiming a piece of our backyard. Next came the clothesline issue. After weeks of back-and-forth discussions, the board finally agreed to allow outdoor clotheslines under certain conditions. They had to be discreet, meaning they couldn't face the street or dominate someone's yard. While the compromise wasn't perfect, it was still a win. A few neighbors immediately took advantage of the new policy, stringing up lines behind fences or in side yards. Seeing laundry flapping gently in the breeze reminded me of simpler times, when life wasn't dictated by aesthetic standards. Mailbox colors were another area where we saw movement. The HOA loosened its grip slightly, adding 2 new shades to the approved palette. One neighbor painted her mailbox a soft sage green, and honestly, it looked fantastic. Even Linda admitted, quietly, of course, that the change added a touch of personality to the neighborhood. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was a step toward making the community feel less cookie-cutter and more human. Not everyone was happy with these changes, though. Some longtime residents grumbled about how the coalition was ruining the neighborhood's charm. "This place is going downhill," one man muttered at the next HOA meeting. Another woman complained that allowing clotheslines made the streets look messy. Mr. Peterson tried to mediate, reminding everyone that compromise meant finding balance, not pleasing everyone all the time. But his words didn't stop the murmurs of discontent from spreading. Despite the pushback, there were moments of unexpected support. Neighbors who had initially stayed silent began thanking us for standing up. One elderly woman stopped me while I was mowing the lawn to say she appreciated our efforts. "I've lived here 20 years, she said, shaking her head, "and this is the first time anyone's dared to challenge them." Her words stuck with me because they highlighted what we were really fighting for, not just specific rules, but the idea that people should have a say in how their community is run. Through it all, Claire and I learned valuable lessons. We realized that no system is perfect, and neither are the people running it. The HOA wasn't inherently evil. It was made up of neighbors trying to do what they thought was best. But good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes, and sometimes, even well-meaning rules can stifle creativity and individuality. Change doesn't happen overnight, but persistence pays off. By the end of those months, I found myself looking at the neighborhood differently. Yes, the HOA still existed, and yes, there were still rules to follow. But now, there was a sense of give and take, a recognition that guidelines shouldn't come at the cost of personal freedom. For every critic, there was someone cheering us on, and for every setback, there was a reminder that progress takes time. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This fight hadn't been easy, but it had brought us closer together, not just as a family, but as a community. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about where we were headed. Today, life in our neighborhood feels different. Not perfect, but better. The backyard garden is thriving, just like it always has, but now it carries a deeper meaning. Those raised beds, once the source of so much frustration, are a symbol of what we fought for: the right to make choices about our own space without living in constant fear of retribution. Every time I water the tomatoes or harvest fresh basil for dinner, I feel a quiet pride. This isn't just a patch of dirt anymore. It's proof that standing up for yourself can lead to change. The HOA hasn't disappeared, of course. Meetings are still held, rules are still enforced, and fines are still issued for things like overgrown lawns or parking violations. But there's a new tone to everything. A recognition that balance matters. Rules exist, Yes, but they're no longer weaponized against us. Instead, they've become guidelines meant to enhance the neighborhood, not control it. It's a subtle difference, but one that makes all the difference in the world. Our coalition, the Backyard Freedom Coalition, is still active, though less intense than before. We meet occasionally, mostly to check in and ensure the HOA doesn't slip back into its old habits. At one recent gathering, Linda, yes, that Linda, joked that she might start drying her sheets outside after seeing how nice mine smelled. "Fresh air does wonders," she said with a wink. Coming from her, it was both surprising and heartwarming. It reminded me that people can change when given the chance. Not everyone agrees with the changes, and that's okay. Some neighbors remain staunch supporters of strict rules, insisting that order keeps property values high. Others grumble under their breath about how the neighborhood has lost its charm. But even among the critics, there's a grudging respect for what we've accomplished. They may not love the compromises, but they can't deny that the community feels more alive than ever. What strikes me most is how connected I feel to my neighbors now. Before the battle with the HOA, I barely knew the people who lived around me. Sure, we exchanged pleasantries at mailboxes or waved as cars passed, but nothing beyond surface-level interactions. Now we share something deeper, a shared experience of fighting for what we believe in. Whether it's swapping tips on growing vegetables or debating the merits of discreet clotheslines, these conversations have brought us closer together. Claire often reminds me how far we've come since that first letter arrived. "Remember when you thought we'd made a huge mistake moving here?" She'll say with a laugh. And I do remember that sinking feeling of dread, the anger, the sense of helplessness. But looking back, I realize those emotions were necessary. They pushed us to take action, to speak up, to fight for something bigger than ourselves. Without them, we might never have discovered the strength of our community or our own resilience. As I sit on the porch this evening, sipping a cup of tea and watching the sunset, I notice the little details that make this place home. Kids playing basketball in driveways, laundry swaying gently in side yards, flower beds bursting with color. It's messy, imperfect, and wonderfully real. This isn't a picture-perfect postcard of suburban life. It's something better. It's a neighborhood where people live, grow, and adapt together. For the first time, I truly understand what it means to belong. Home isn't just a house or a set of rules. It's the connections we build, the battles we fight, and the victories we celebrate along the way. And while I know challenges will come again, I also know we're ready to face them together. Because in the end, that's what makes a house a home, not the walls that surround it, but the people who fill it with life.